The Green Lantern Corps was never built to resemble human society. Its structure extends across sectors that do not share the same biological clocks, emotional rhythms, or cultural assumptions about maturity. Within its luminous architecture, species that live for centuries stand beside those whose entire civilizations rise and collapse in what others would perceive as a brief moment. The Corps does not ask whether these differences can be reconciled. It assumes that they must coexist. Authority, responsibility, and trust must function in a system where the meaning of time itself varies from one member to another. From the outside, the Corps appears orderly, a constellation of guardianship projected across the universe. Rings that choose their bearers through a logic of courage and willpower. Patrol routes that transform scattered individuals into a network of cosmic sentinels. Yet beneath this architecture lies a subtle instability. The Corps requires cooperation between beings whose concepts of adulthood, intimacy, and emotional development are shaped by entirely different evolutionary histories. The institution functions because it suppresses the question of difference long enough to preserve the illusion of unity. Hal Jordan emerges from Earth, a culture defined by narrow lifespans and rigid moral expectations surrounding relationships, maturity, and power. His world measures adulthood through biological age and social milestones. Human societies draw boundaries around intimacy, using numerical thresholds that attempt to convert psychological readiness into a calendar event. Within that framework, time becomes a regulator of morality. Numbers stand in for judgment. But the Corps operates in another dimension of time. A lantern might live for several centuries. Another might reach psychological maturity within a decade. Some species begin their conscious life already capable of responsibilities that humans would associate with middle age. The Ring does not evaluate these differences through human categories. It responds to a single quality: will. In this environment, relationships between lanterns develop under conditions that would appear disorienting to observers grounded in human culture. Emotional bonds form between beings who do not share the same temporal scale. Mentorship becomes intertwined with companionship. Respect for courage and competence often overrides biological or chronological markers that would otherwise define social boundaries. It is within this environment that the relationship between Hal Jordan and Arisia emerges. At first glance, their connection appears to follow a familiar pattern. A veteran lantern and a younger recruit navigating the immense pressures of the Corps. A bond formed through shared missions, proximity, and admiration. The narrative framework resembles countless other stories within the mythology of heroic partnerships. But something within this dynamic resists simple categorization. Arisia does not belong to Earth. Her species does not experience maturation according to human standards. Her development occurs within a biological and cultural rhythm unfamiliar to Hal Jordan's world. When observers attempt to evaluate their relationship through the moral frameworks of Earth, the situation becomes unstable. Questions appear immediately. What does age mean when two individuals exist within entirely different lifespans? What does maturity signify when psychological development does not align with biological chronology? And what happens when authority, admiration, and intimacy begin to overlap within a system already structured by hierarchy and mentorship? The Green Lantern Corps provides no clear answer. It was never designed to resolve this type of ambiguity. Its focus remains on maintaining order across sectors that would otherwise collapse into chaos. Personal relationships unfold within its structure as secondary phenomena. Unregulated currents flowing through an institution built to control power, not intimacy. Yet the relationship between Hal Jordan and Arisia gradually moves from the background to the center of attention. Not because it represents the most dramatic conflict within the mythology of the Corps, but because it exposes a fracture hidden within the narrative foundations of the universe itself. A fracture between biological age and psychological maturity. between human moral frameworks and interstellar cultural relativism, between mentorship and attraction. Once this fracture becomes visible, it cannot easily be ignored. For readers observing from Earth, the situation produces an immediate tension. The instinctive reaction is to translate the scenario into familiar ethical categories, to measure Arisia's age against human developmental stages, to judge Hal Jordan's actions according to the expectations placed upon authority figures within human society. But the universe of the core resists that translation. Its structure undermines the certainty of those judgments. Time behaves differently here. Growth unfolds under different conditions. The very notion of adulthood becomes fluid when species evolve under separate gravitational, biological, and cultural pressures. Within this environment, the relationship between Hal Jordan and Arisia becomes more than a controversial narrative choice. It transforms into a psychological mirror reflecting the limitations of human perception. The audience is forced to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the moral frameworks that appear self-evident on Earth are not universally applicable. Or perhaps they are. The tension lies precisely in that uncertainty. Hal Jordan carries the weight of human expectations into a system that does not fully recognize them. Arisia carries the perspective of a civilization whose developmental markers do not correspond to human assumptions about youth and maturity. When their paths intersect, the narrative becomes an arena where two incompatible interpretations of time and consent collide. At first, the collision is subtle. It appears only in fragments, moments of admiration, instances of mentorship, small shifts in emotional proximity that gradually alter the structure of their relationship. Then the tension begins to expand. Observers start to question the boundaries between guidance and attraction, between admiration and dependency, between cultural difference and ethical transgression. What initially appeared as a private connection between two lanterns begins to radiate outward through the narrative ecosystem. The relationship becomes a focal point where competing moral systems attempt to impose their interpretation of reality. The core itself remains largely indifferent. Its mission continues. Patrols move across sectors. Threats emerge and disappear. Lanterns fall, and new ones are chosen. The institution maintains its rhythm as though personal conflicts exist on a separate layer of existence. But the audience cannot maintain that distance. For them, the relationship between Hal Jordan and Arisia becomes a test of interpretation, a question without a stable answer. Is age a biological number anchored to physical development, a psychological stage defined by experience and autonomy, or a cultural construct shaped by the society observing the relationship? The Green Lantern Corps offers no definitive resolution. Instead, it provides a stage where these questions unfold. And once the questions emerge, the narrative can no longer pretend they were never there. Before their relationship becomes controversial, before readers begin measuring the situation through the moral frameworks of Earth, Hal Jordan and Arisia exist within the mythology of the Green Lantern Corps as two very different manifestations of the same archetype. Both are chosen by the ring. Both represent courage under pressure. Both become agents of a cosmic order that attempts to impose structure on a universe constantly sliding toward entropy. Yet the psychological foundations that bring them into that position could not be more different. Hal Jordan emerges from a cultural environment where heroism is tightly bound to individual will. Earth's mythology of courage celebrates the figure who stands alone, who acts even when institutions fail, who transforms personal conviction into action despite uncertainty. His identity is shaped long before the ring chooses him. The profession of test pilot trains the mind to confront fear directly. Speed, risk, and mechanical precision become extensions of personality. Every flight carries the possibility of catastrophe, yet the act of flying remains irresistible. That psychological formation produces a particular type of hero, Hal Jordan does not merely confront danger. He gravitates toward it. His courage is inseparable from the exhilaration of control in unstable environments. The ring recognizes this quality immediately. It does not choose him because he is morally flawless or emotionally balanced. It chooses him because his relationship with fear resembles a confrontation rather than an avoidance. This orientation toward danger also shapes Hal Jordan's emotional life. Authority figures rarely remain unquestioned in his worldview. Institutional rules appear negotiable when they conflict with instinct. Loyalty emerges through shared risk rather than through hierarchical obedience. Within the core, these qualities transform him into both a powerful lantern and a difficult subordinate. His will is enormous, but it rarely operates quietly within the structures designed to contain it. Arisia's origin unfolds within an entirely different psychological landscape. She is born into a civilization already integrated into the larger cosmic network represented by the core. The idea of interstellar responsibility is not an abstraction within her culture. It is a visible structure of power and order that exists beyond the boundaries of her home world. Where Hal Jordan's identity is forged through confrontation with the unknown, Arisia grows up with the knowledge that guardians already patrol the universe. This difference quietly alters the meaning of courage. For Hal Jordan, courage involves stepping into an uncharted arena. For Arisia, courage emerges through the desire to join an institution that already exists. The ring represents aspiration rather than disruption. To become a lantern means entering a tradition that precedes her. Her relationship to authority therefore begins from a place of admiration rather than skepticism. The core appears as a structure worthy of loyalty. Its lanterns represent figures to emulate. Within this framework, the psychological development of Arisia does not involve rebellion against institutions. It involves proximity to them. When the ring eventually selects her, that admiration quickly concentrates around the lantern assigned to guide her integration into the core. Hal Jordan becomes the focal point of this process, not merely as a fellow lantern, but as a living representation of the heroic ideal she associated with the core long before she joined it. This dynamic immediately introduces a subtle asymmetry into their relationship. Hal Jordan occupies the position of veteran. Arisia enters as the initiate. The structure resembles mentorship, a common arrangement within the core as experienced lanterns help newcomers adapt to the demands of interstellar duty. Under ordinary circumstances, this relationship might remain purely professional. Yet the emotional context surrounding Arisia's perspective complicates the situation. Her admiration does not emerge from abstract respect for rank or competence. It emerges from a formative image of heroism. The lantern who once existed as a distant symbol now stands before her as a tangible presence. The psychological distance between myth and reality collapses. Hal Jordan, for his part, does not initially perceive the deeper significance of this admiration. From his perspective, the situation resembles many other mentor relationships within the core. Lanterns routinely guide younger recruits through their first missions. Experience naturally creates a gradient of authority between them. What appears to Arisia as an encounter with a living legend appears to Hal Jordan as routine responsibility. The imbalance begins to deepen through proximity. Shared missions create opportunities for trust to develop under pressure. The ring binds their survival to coordinated action. In combat situations, hesitation can mean death. Lanterns quickly learn to rely on each other's instincts. Trust formed in these circumstances carries a particular psychological intensity. It emerges not through conversation or gradual acquaintance, but through moments where one person's decision determines the other's survival. Such bonds accelerate emotional closeness. The battlefield compresses time. Within this compressed environment, admiration evolves. Arisia begins to see Hal Jordan not only as a hero, but as a person. His confidence becomes visible. His impulsiveness appears alongside his bravery. The flaws that humanize him do not diminish her admiration. They amplify it. The myth becomes tangible. For Hal Jordan, the transformation is slower. His attention remains oriented toward duty, toward the practical demands of maintaining order across sectors. The emotional significance of Arisia's presence remains partially outside his awareness. She is capable, determined, and eager to prove herself. Those qualities command respect, but they do not initially alter the structure of their relationship. Yet admiration has a gravitational effect. Over time it pulls perception into new configurations. Arisia's confidence grows. Her competence becomes undeniable. She no longer appears merely as a recruit, but as a lantern capable of standing beside him during dangerous missions. The difference between mentor and partner begins to narrow. It is at this point that the deeper psychological tension begins to form. Because Arisia's species does not mature along the same timeline as humans, her physical and emotional development operates within parameters unfamiliar to Hal Jordan's cultural assumptions. What appears youthful through the lens of human biology does not necessarily correspond to psychological immaturity within her species. The markers humans use to identify adolescence and adulthood become unreliable. This ambiguity introduces a structural instability into the relationship. Hal Jordan continues to perceive Arisia through the interpretive frameworks of Earth. Instinctively, he measures maturity through visual and behavioral cues shaped by human society. Yet the context surrounding Arisia challenges those assumptions. Her intelligence is undeniable. Her courage is genuine. Her decision-making during missions demonstrates the composure expected from experienced lanterns. Each of these qualities complicates the intuitive boundaries Hal Jordan might otherwise maintain. Arisia's perspective evolves in parallel. Her admiration begins to shift towards something more complex. The hero she once observed from a distance becomes an emotional reference point. Proximity transforms respect into attachment. The mentor figure gradually acquires new significance. In another context, such feelings might remain private or fade with time. Within the core, they intensify. Lanterns operate in environments where isolation from civilian life becomes the norm. Shared danger replaces ordinary social interaction. Emotional connections form under pressure rather than through gradual domestic familiarity. The core itself provides no clear structure for regulating these dynamics. Its focus remains on maintaining order across the universe. Personal relationships fall outside the formal framework of its authority. Lanterns navigate those complexities individually. As Hal Jordan and Arisia continue working together, the psychological currents surrounding them become increasingly difficult to ignore. Admiration and companionship intertwine. Authority and intimacy begin to occupy the same space. What began as mentorship gradually transforms into something less easily defined. The transformation does not occur through a single dramatic moment. It unfolds through accumulation, conversations between missions, quiet intervals between crises, small gestures of trust that gradually alter the emotional landscape surrounding them. Neither of them initially recognizes the implications of this shift. For Arisia, the change feels natural, a continuation of the admiration that first drew her toward the core. For Hal Jordan, the emotional significance remains partially obscured by the routine demands of duty. But once admiration begins to evolve into attraction, the fragile equilibrium that once defined their relationship begins to fracture. And the question that had remained invisible until that moment slowly rises to the surface. What does age actually mean in a universe where time itself refuses to behave according to human expectations? The moment the relationship between Hal Jordan and Arisia begins to change cannot be located in a single scene. It does not erupt through confession or dramatic revelation. Instead, it unfolds through a gradual rearrangement of emotional gravity, the kind that occurs when two individuals spend enough time navigating danger together that admiration begins to acquire a different texture. Within the operational structure of the Green Lantern Corps, this transformation is easy to overlook. Lanterns travel constantly. Patrol assignments stretch across sectors that contain thousands of inhabited systems. Encounters with hostile forces interrupt any attempt to maintain predictable rhythms of personal life. In this environment, emotional proximity develops in irregular intervals. Conversations between battles carry unusual weight because they occur under the shadow of survival. Arisia continues to grow more capable with each mission. Her command of the ring becomes sharper, more precise. She learns to shape constructs not only through instinct, but through strategy. Her courage begins to resemble Hal Jordan's own relationship with danger, a willingness to step forward when hesitation would feel safer. From Hal Jordan's perspective, this progression confirms what he had already sensed in her potential. Lanterns who survive their early assignments often transform rapidly under pressure. The ring amplifies personal will, and individuals who possess that quality evolve quickly once they understand the instrument they have been given. Yet something about Arisia's development carries an additional layer of intensity. Her determination is not driven solely by duty to the Corps. It also reflects the desire to stand beside the figure who first embodied the ideal she sought to join. Hal Jordan remains the silent reference point around which her confidence organizes itself. During missions, this dynamic manifests in subtle ways. Arisia anticipates his strategies. She adjusts her constructs to complement his approach to combat. In chaotic situations, she gravitates instinctively toward his position in the battlefield, not out of dependency, but because coordination between them feels almost effortless. Hal Jordan notices the efficiency first. On several occasions, he recognizes that Arisia has predicted his decisions before he speaks them aloud. Their constructs begin to move together with increasing synchronicity. In combat, this compatibility is invaluable. Two lanterns operating in perfect coordination can transform the balance of a conflict within seconds. But efficiency is only the visible surface of the phenomenon. Beneath it lies a psychological alignment that begins to reshape how they perceive each other. The mentor and recruit structure that once defined their interactions starts to dissolve under the pressure of shared competence. Authority becomes less pronounced when two individuals repeatedly survive the same threats together. Experience equalizes perception. Arisia no longer appears as the inexperienced lantern who once required guidance. She appears as a partner whose presence stabilizes unpredictable situations. The shift alters Hal Jordan's awareness gradually. Respect replaces protective caution. He begins to rely on her judgment without consciously examining why that trust has become so natural. The operational relationship between them has evolved. For Arisia, the transformation carries deeper emotional consequences. As the distance between them narrows, the admiration that once functioned as aspiration begins to transform into attachment. The heroic figure she once observed from afar now exists within the same space of experience. His decisions affect her survival. Her presence affects his. In psychological terms, the myth collapses into intimacy. This collapse introduces a form of tension neither of them fully recognizes. When admiration becomes attachment, the mind begins reorganizing the meaning of proximity. Conversations between missions acquire new resonance. Moments of quiet after battle linger longer than before. Awareness sharpens around gestures that previously seemed insignificant. For Arisia, the transition feels almost inevitable. The hero she admired is also the person who shares her most intense experiences. In the compressed emotional landscape of the Corps, such proximity generates a powerful gravitational pull. Courage, competence, and familiarity merge into something difficult to separate. Hal Jordan initially resists interpreting these signals through a personal lens. His identity remains anchored in the operational logic of the Corps. Lanterns cooperate, survive, and move on to the next assignment. Emotional entanglement has never been central to how he navigates the universe. Yet resistance does not eliminate perception. Gradually he becomes aware that Arisia's attention carries a focus that extends beyond professional respect. The realization arrives not as a revelation, but as a quiet recognition, the kind that occurs when a pattern suddenly becomes visible. He begins to notice the pauses in conversation that linger a little longer than expected, the way Arisia studies his reactions during strategic discussions, the unusual intensity behind simple questions that might otherwise pass unnoticed. None of these signals appear inappropriate in isolation. Within the flexible social structure of the core, personal bonds between lanterns are common. Trust is essential when lives depend on coordination under extreme conditions. But the cumulative effect produces an unmistakable change in atmosphere. At first, Hal Jordan interprets the situation through the language of mentorship. Younger lanterns often develop strong emotional loyalty toward those who guide them during their early missions. The psychological pressure of combat amplifies these attachments. They resemble the bonds formed between soldiers who survive the same battlefield. Yet even this explanation begins to feel incomplete. Because Arisia's behavior does not reflect dependency. She does not seek reassurance or validation in moments of uncertainty. Her decisions in combat demonstrate independent judgment. If anything, her emotional attention appears to emerge from strength rather than vulnerability. This realization unsettles Hal Jordan more than he initially admits. Authority becomes easier to maintain when the other person remains clearly subordinate in experience or confidence. Arisia's rapid development destabilizes that structure. She now occupies a space closer to equality than to apprenticeship, and equality introduces ambiguity. The ambiguity intensifies during a series of missions where the two lanterns operate almost exclusively together. Patrol routes assigned by the Guardians place them on extended rotations through unstable sectors. Weeks pass without returning to OA. The isolation removes the subtle social boundaries that normally regulate interactions between lanterns. Within this environment, personal conversations begin to emerge naturally. The silence between assignments invites reflection. Lanterns who spend enough time together inevitably begin sharing fragments of their lives beyond the core. Arisia speaks about her home world with a mixture of nostalgia and curiosity. The core has already begun to alter how she perceives her own civilization. Traveling across sectors exposes her to cultures that make her upbringing appear small in retrospect. Hal Jordan responds with stories from Earth, though he often describes them with the detached humor of someone who has already begun to outgrow the gravity of those memories. The contrast between their perspectives creates an unusual conversational rhythm. For Arisia, Hal Jordan's past contains the weight of origin. For Hal Jordan, Arisia's perspective represents a future he never anticipated when he first received the ring. These exchanges gradually deepen their emotional awareness of each other. They begin to see the world through each other's cultural assumptions. What once appeared obvious becomes strange when filtered through a different species' interpretation of time, responsibility, and maturity. It is during these conversations that the underlying tension finally surfaces. Arisia begins to question how humans define adulthood. She speaks about the ways different civilizations measure readiness for responsibility. Some species mature within a few years. Others require decades. The variability across the universe makes human social boundaries appear unusually rigid. Hal Jordan listens with mild amusement at first. To him, the conversation resembles the philosophical curiosity that often arises among lanterns who spend too much time traveling between civilizations. Cultural comparison becomes a form of entertainment during long patrol routes. But the tone of Arisia's questions slowly becomes more personal. She asks whether human maturity truly emerges from chronological age, or from the experiences that shape judgment and courage. Whether the number assigned to someone's years actually reflects the capacity to make decisions about loyalty, risk, and attachment. The conversation lingers. Hal Jordan responds cautiously. His instinct tells him the discussion is no longer abstract. Something beneath the surface has begun pressing toward articulation. He answers in the language of Earth's cultural assumptions. Humans rely on numbers because they provide structure. Without those boundaries, society would struggle to define responsibility or protect the vulnerable. Arisia listens without challenging him directly. But her silence carries a quiet persistence, because in her experience, maturity does not follow a single universal timeline. And if that is true, then the meaning of age begins to lose its certainty. The question Arisia introduces does not dissolve after their conversation. It settles quietly between them and begins to alter the rhythm of their interactions. Neither of them returns to it directly at first, yet its presence becomes unmistakable in the way pauses appear within ordinary exchanges. What once existed as a straightforward mentorship now unfolds within a new interpretive space where admiration, responsibility, and attraction begin to occupy overlapping ground. For Hal Jordan, this shift produces a form of discomfort that feels unfamiliar. He has spent his life confronting danger in environments where decisions must be made instantly and where hesitation carries visible consequences. Tactical dilemmas follow a clear internal logic. Threats must be contained, lives must be protected, and failure reveals itself immediately through loss or destruction. The tension emerging with Arisia does not operate within that structure. It unfolds entirely within perception, within the silent arena where motives are examined not by enemies or commanders, but by the uneasy voice of one's own judgment. Arisia, from her perspective, experiences the change differently. Her admiration for Hal Jordan has always contained sincerity, but it was initially directed toward the image of a hero who existed at the edge of her imagination. That distance made the feeling simple. Now that distance has disappeared. Shared missions, shared survival, and the accumulation of small conversations have transformed the symbol into a person whose presence occupies her emotional horizon with increasing clarity. The hero she admired has become someone she understands. This transformation does not feel troubling to her. It feels natural. Admiration evolves into respect, respect into companionship, and companionship into attachment. Within the compressed emotional environment of the Green Lantern Corps, such transitions occur frequently. Lanterns spend long stretches of time isolated from ordinary social structures, navigating danger alongside the same individuals. Trust formed under these conditions develops quickly and often carries emotional intensity that would take years to form in civilian life. Hal Jordan senses the gravity of this shift earlier than Arisia realizes. His instincts tell him that something in their dynamic has begun to cross a boundary he once assumed would remain fixed. The difficulty lies in identifying exactly where that boundary originates. Within the operational culture of the Corps, there is nothing unusual about lanterns developing close bonds. Survival demands cooperation. Emotional trust often emerges naturally from repeated exposure to danger. Yet Hal Jordan also carries the interpretive framework of Earth within his perception. Human societies rely on chronological age to establish clear divisions between developmental stages. Those divisions function as protective structures designed to prevent exploitation and imbalance. They create a visible line that marks when certain forms of intimacy become morally acceptable. That system assumes biological maturity progresses along a predictable timeline. Arisia's existence destabilizes that assumption. Her species does not develop along the same biological curve as humans. The visible markers that Earth associates with youth and adulthood do not align with the psychological autonomy she demonstrates during missions. She commands the ring with confidence. She makes decisions under pressure that affect the survival of entire populations. Her actions consistently display the judgment expected from a fully responsible lantern. This contradiction forces Hal Jordan into a space of introspection he rarely occupies. Instinct alone would interpret their growing closeness as an ordinary consequence of shared experience. The logic of proximity would suggest that two individuals who repeatedly risk their lives together might naturally develop deeper emotional connections. Yet instinct begins to collide with the cultural framework he carries from Earth. Arisia gradually becomes aware of this internal conflict, although she cannot fully identify its origin. She notices the moments where Hal Jordan pauses during conversations that once flowed effortlessly. The hesitation is subtle, but it appears often enough to create curiosity. His tone remains warm and familiar, yet occasionally his expression suggests that he is measuring something invisible before responding. Eventually she asks him directly whether human societies truly believe that maturity can be defined through a number assigned to someone's years. The question is delivered without accusation. It emerges through the same calm curiosity that has characterized many of their discussions about the civilizations they encounter during patrols. Lanterns frequently compare the social structures of different species as a way of understanding the diversity of the universe they protect. Hal Jordan answers with caution. Human cultures developed numerical thresholds because they needed a reliable method to protect individuals who might not yet possess the psychological capacity to navigate complex relationships. Chronological age became a practical tool. It does not perfectly measure maturity, but it creates a visible boundary that discourages exploitation and imbalance of power. Arisia listens carefully. She does not dismiss the reasoning behind this system. She understands that civilizations with short lifespans and gradual development would require clear structures to protect their young. But she also recognizes the limitation embedded within that framework. It assumes that biological age reliably corresponds to emotional autonomy. In the universe she has begun to explore, that assumption rarely holds. The Green Lantern Corps itself illustrates this problem. Lanterns originate from civilizations whose lifespans differ dramatically. Some species reach intellectual maturity within only a few years. Others spend decades in developmental phases before achieving independence. The Guardians do not attempt to impose a universal timeline across these variations. They evaluate candidates through a different measure entirely: the capacity to wield the ring responsibly. By that standard, Arisia has already demonstrated her readiness. She does not present this observation as an argument about their relationship. She frames it as a reflection on how different cultures interpret responsibility. Yet the implication remains visible between them. If maturity can be measured through capability rather than years, then the meaning of age begins to lose its certainty. Hal Jordan recognizes the direction of the conversation immediately. The discussion has moved beyond abstract philosophy and entered the territory where their personal connection becomes the unspoken subject. For a moment he considers closing the discussion entirely. The Corps regularly encounters cultural practices that conflict with the moral assumptions of Earth. Lanterns often learn to tolerate these differences through a form of pragmatic relativism. But the situation does not allow him that distance. He is not observing another civilization's customs. He is the person whose judgment now stands at the center of the ambiguity. That realization intensifies the pressure he feels. Hal Jordan has never been particularly concerned with the approval of institutions, yet the possibility that his perception might be flawed unsettles him more than external criticism ever could. Arisia senses the weight of that realization even though he does not articulate it. She notices that his responses grow more measured, as though he is carefully arranging each thought before allowing it to emerge. The emotional clarity that once defined their interactions now carries a layer of restraint that neither of them fully understands. From that moment forward, their relationship enters a new stage. The ease that once defined their companionship remains visible, yet beneath it a fracture has appeared. Every mission they share now unfolds within the presence of that fracture. Cooperation continues seamlessly. Trust remains absolute, but both of them are aware that the emotional gravity between them has begun to reorganize itself. Two interpretations of reality now occupy the same space. One interpretation measures maturity through the protective structures of Earth, where chronological age functions as a moral boundary designed to prevent imbalance and exploitation. The other interpretation emerges from a universe where biological timelines vary so widely that responsibility must be evaluated through competence and autonomy rather than years. Neither framework resolves the tension. Instead, they begin to pull the relationship in opposite directions, creating a psychological polarity that neither Hal Jordan nor Arisia can fully escape. And once that polarity becomes visible, the possibility of returning to the simplicity of their original mentorship quietly disappears. Once the fracture between interpretation and reality becomes visible, the relationship between Hal Jordan and Arisia enters a phase where every action carries symbolic weight beyond its immediate context. Their partnership continues in operational terms exactly as before. Patrol routes are executed, threats are contained, civilizations that will never know their names are protected from extinction. From the outside, nothing appears different, but internally the equilibrium has shifted. The core operates across vast distances where supervision is minimal and trust becomes the foundation of its structure. Lanterns are expected to exercise judgment independently. The Guardians provide strategic direction, but the day-to-day reality of maintaining order across the galaxy depends on the decisions of individuals who often work far beyond the reach of immediate oversight. Within that system, personal relationships develop with relatively little regulation. For most Lanterns, this autonomy functions without difficulty. Emotional attachments form and dissolve as patrol assignments change. Lanterns move between sectors and partners with the fluidity expected from an institution built around mobility rather than permanence. Bonds exist, but they rarely become central to the mythology of the core. The relationship between Hal Jordan and Arisia slowly begins to diverge from that pattern. Part of this divergence comes from the visibility attached to Hal Jordan himself. Among Lanterns, he occupies an unusual position. His actions have repeatedly drawn attention within the core. Victories against threats that would have overwhelmed other Lanterns have elevated his reputation. His defiance of authority in moments where the Guardians appeared indecisive has turned him into a figure whose presence carries narrative gravity. When such a figure becomes emotionally connected to another Lantern, the connection inevitably attracts attention. At first, the attention remains subtle. Fellow Lanterns notice the consistency with which Hal Jordan and Arisia appear together during patrol rotations. They observe the efficiency of their coordination during missions. The core values competence above all else, so their effectiveness as a pair does not immediately generate suspicion. Yet awareness spreads gradually through observation rather than accusation. Lanterns operate within a culture that relies on perception rather than formal surveillance. They learn to read behavior the same way they read battlefield conditions. Patterns reveal themselves through repetition. The pattern surrounding Hal Jordan and Arisia becomes difficult to ignore. Some Lanterns interpret the situation through a pragmatic lens. Emotional attachments between Lanterns are inevitable in a system built on constant exposure to danger. If the partnership enhances their effectiveness in combat, then the core benefits from its existence. Within that interpretation, the relationship becomes simply another variation of the bonds that form between individuals who survive extreme circumstances together. Others view the situation with greater caution. They recognize the asymmetry that once defined the beginning of the relationship. The memory of Arisia entering the core under Hal Jordan's mentorship remains part of the narrative. Even if her competence has long since erased any practical imbalance between them, the symbolic origin of their connection continues to cast a shadow. Symbolic origins matter within institutions built on trust, because authority does not only operate through present reality, it also operates through memory, through the perception of how relationships began and what power dynamics existed during their formation. Hal Jordan becomes aware of this growing attention before anyone speaks openly about it. Lanterns who once treated their partnership as routine now watch them with a slightly different focus during gatherings on OA. Conversations pause when they approach. Nothing overtly hostile occurs. The core is not prone to moral crusades or internal gossip, but perception has changed. Arisia notices the shift as well. For her, the attention feels less troubling than confusing. She has never perceived her connection with Hal Jordan as something that required secrecy. Within her cultural framework, the evolution of their relationship follows a coherent path. Two individuals who respect each other grow closer through shared experience. That progression feels honest rather than transgressive, yet she can sense that others interpret the situation through different assumptions. The tension eventually crystallizes during a routine return to OA after a sequence of extended patrols. Lanterns gather in the central chambers where reports are delivered and strategies discussed. These moments function as the closest equivalent the core has to communal life. Lanterns who have spent months isolated across sectors reconnect briefly before dispersing again. It is within this environment that the symbolic weight surrounding Hal Jordan and Arisia becomes impossible to ignore. The conversation begins indirectly. Lanterns discuss recent conflicts, unusual civilizations encountered during patrol routes, and the unpredictable behavior of emerging threats across several sectors. Gradually, the discussion shifts toward broader questions about the nature of the core itself, about how a single institution attempts to coordinate individuals from species whose cultures and biological timelines differ so dramatically. One lantern raises the observation that the core relies heavily on personal judgment because universal regulations cannot account for every cultural variation across the galaxy. What appears morally obvious in one civilization might appear absurd or oppressive in another. The remark hangs in the air. Everyone present understands the underlying reference. No accusation is spoken directly. The core rarely engages in open condemnation. Its culture favors reflection rather than confrontation. Yet the conversation has clearly moved into territory where the relationship between Hal Jordan and Arisia functions as the unspoken example. Hal Jordan feels the shift immediately. He recognizes the pattern forming around the discussion. Lanterns are not questioning his courage or his loyalty to the core. They are examining the philosophical boundaries of cultural relativism within an institution that spans thousands of civilizations. The implication is unavoidable. If lanterns must navigate ethical frameworks across different species and cultures, then the core must also decide whether any universal moral boundaries exist at all. Arisia listens to the conversation without fear. The philosophical tone of the discussion resonates with the questions she had already been exploring privately. She understands that the core cannot impose a single cultural framework across every species it protects. The diversity of civilizations makes that impossible. But she also recognizes that perception matters. Even if a relationship is internally coherent for those involved, the symbolic meaning it carries for observers may differ dramatically. Hal Jordan senses that same tension. He realizes that the issue no longer belongs exclusively to him and Arisia. Their relationship has become a focal point through which the core itself begins examining the limits of its moral flexibility. The Guardians remain silent throughout the exchange. Their presence above the chamber introduces a different kind of pressure. They rarely intervene in personal matters among lanterns. Their role is to maintain the strategic integrity of the core rather than regulate emotional lives. But their silence does not imply indifference. It implies observation. The discussion eventually dissipates without formal resolution. Lanterns disperse back to their assignments. The operational machinery of the core continues without interruption. No rule has been broken. No verdict has been issued. Yet something fundamental has changed. The relationship between Hal Jordan and Arisia has crossed the threshold from private ambiguity into symbolic significance. It now functions as a question that the core itself must quietly consider. What happens when an institution built on universal diversity encounters a moral dilemma that refuses to align with any single cultural framework? The answer does not arrive through judgment. It arrives through tension, and tension, once introduced into a system, rarely disappears without leaving a permanent mark. Once the relationship between Hal Jordan and Arisia crosses the boundary between private connection and symbolic controversy, its meaning expands far beyond the characters themselves. Within the internal mythology of the Green Lantern Corps, the issue already carries philosophical implications about authority, maturity, and cultural relativism. But the true amplification occurs outside the narrative world, within the interpretive space where readers attempt to translate fictional events through the moral frameworks of their own society. The moment readers encounter the relationship, an instinctive process begins. Fiction does not remain confined within its own universe. Audiences continuously map fictional dynamics onto familiar cultural structures. The Green Lantern Corps may operate across galaxies where species evolve according to radically different biological timelines, yet the audience observing that world remains anchored to the moral architecture of Earth. Interpretation becomes inevitable. From that perspective, the relationship between Hal Jordan and Arisia immediately triggers discomfort. Human societies rely on clear chronological markers to regulate intimacy and authority. Age functions as a visible boundary that separates developmental stages and attempts to prevent exploitation. The simplicity of this system lies in its clarity. Numbers eliminate ambiguity, but the narrative context surrounding Arisia dissolves that clarity. She is not human. Her species does not mature along the same biological path. The visual cues readers associate with youth conflict with the psychological autonomy she demonstrates throughout the story. The result is a collision between two interpretive frameworks. Readers must decide which framework they will prioritize. Some observers interpret the relationship entirely through human moral structures. From this perspective, the ambiguity surrounding alien lifespans becomes irrelevant. What matters is the visual and narrative impression of asymmetry. The mentorship that once existed between Hal Jordan and Arisia reinforces this interpretation. Authority figures entering romantic relationships with those they once guided raise immediate ethical concerns within human culture. In this reading, Hal Jordan becomes a symbol of compromised responsibility. His courage as a lantern remains unquestioned, but his judgment in personal matters appears flawed. The relationship becomes an example of how admiration and authority can distort emotional boundaries. Other readers approach the situation through the broader logic of the Green Lantern Corps itself. They observe that the institution operates across civilizations whose biological timelines differ dramatically. Within such a system, chronological age cannot function as a universal standard. Responsibility must instead be evaluated through competence and autonomy. From this perspective, Arisia's actions throughout the narrative demonstrate her independence clearly. She commands the ring with confidence. She makes strategic decisions during missions that affect the survival of entire populations. Her emotional attachment to Hal Jordan emerges not from vulnerability, but from strength. In this interpretation, the discomfort surrounding the relationship reveals more about the limitations of human cultural assumptions than about the characters themselves. The conflict between these interpretations transforms the relationship into a cultural mirror. Readers are no longer simply evaluating fictional characters. They are examining the boundaries of their own moral frameworks. The question shifts from whether Hal Jordan's actions are acceptable to whether human definitions of maturity can be applied universally across species. Popular culture often functions as a testing ground for such questions. Fiction allows societies to explore ethical tensions that would be difficult to confront directly in everyday life. The distance created by narrative provides space for debate without immediate real-world consequences. Within this process, the relationship between Hal Jordan and Arisia becomes a symbolic arena where competing moral instincts attempt to establish dominance. One instinct emphasizes protection. It argues that moral boundaries exist precisely to prevent the misuse of power and authority. Even if Arisia demonstrates autonomy within the narrative, the symbolic structure of their relationship echoes patterns that human societies recognize as potentially exploitative. The other instinct emphasizes context. It suggests that moral judgments must adapt when circumstances differ fundamentally from those that produce the original rules. If the Green Lantern Corps operates across civilizations where biological timelines vary dramatically, then applying human standards without adjustment may distort rather than clarify the situation. Neither instinct can easily eliminate the other. The tension between them becomes part of the narrative's legacy within popular culture. Discussions about the relationship often reveal more about the cultural assumptions of the audience than about the internal logic of the Green Lantern mythology itself. Readers project their own expectations about power, maturity, and responsibility onto characters who exist within a universe that was never designed to follow human social structures precisely. This projection process amplifies the symbolic significance of Hal Jordan and Arisia as characters. They become more than participants in a controversial storyline. They become figures through which audiences negotiate broader anxieties about authority, attraction, and moral certainty. The amplification is intensified by the visibility of the Green Lantern franchise within comic book culture. Hal Jordan is not an obscure figure operating at the margins of the DC universe. He occupies a central position within the mythology of heroism. His actions therefore carry symbolic weight beyond their immediate narrative context. When a character associated with courage and moral conviction becomes involved in an ethically ambiguous relationship, the resulting tension attracts sustained attention. The audience must reconcile two conflicting images: the heroic protector of the universe and the individual whose personal choices generate discomfort. Arisia's role within this symbolic structure is equally complex. She embodies the ambiguity surrounding alien maturity and cultural relativism. Her competence as a lantern contradicts the visual signals that human readers associate with youth. This contradiction destabilizes intuitive judgments. If Arisia were clearly portrayed as immature or dependent, the moral interpretation of the relationship would become simpler. But the narrative repeatedly emphasizes her agency and intelligence. She is not manipulated into attachment. Her feelings emerge through admiration that gradually evolves into mutual connection. This portrayal complicates attempts to categorize her as either vulnerable or fully autonomous according to human expectations. The resulting uncertainty fuels debate within the audience. Discussions about the storyline often shift between ethical analysis and narrative interpretation. Some readers argue that the relationship represents a misjudgment by the writers, an example of how fictional universes sometimes overlook the cultural implications of their storytelling choices. Others defend the narrative as an exploration of interstellar diversity, where applying human assumptions about maturity may oversimplify the complexity of alien civilizations. Both positions reveal the same underlying dynamic. Fictional narratives do not exist in isolation from the societies that consume them. They interact continuously with the moral and cultural frameworks of their audiences. Characters become symbolic vessels through which broader questions about power and responsibility are explored. In this sense, the controversy surrounding Hal Jordan and Arisia becomes part of the mythology of the Green Lantern Corps itself. The relationship continues to provoke discussion precisely because it refuses to resolve the tension between competing interpretations. The Corps represents a universe where diversity is not merely aesthetic but structural. Its lanterns come from civilizations that challenge the universality of human assumptions about time, growth, and autonomy. When such diversity intersects with emotional relationships, the resulting ambiguity exposes the limits of moral frameworks built within a single cultural context. The audience observing this ambiguity must confront a choice. Either maintain the certainty of human moral boundaries, even when the narrative context undermines them, or accept that those boundaries become unstable when applied to civilizations that do not share the same biological and cultural foundations. The story itself offers no definitive answer. Instead, it allows the tension to remain visible, and that visibility becomes the source of its enduring symbolic power. The relationship between Hal Jordan and Arisia does not conclude with a decisive judgment within the mythology of the Green Lantern Corps. No tribunal delivers a verdict. No institutional decree emerges to redefine the boundaries of intimacy across species and civilizations. The Corps continues its patrols across the universe with the same operational rhythm that existed before the controversy appeared. Threats rise and fall. Lanterns are chosen and replaced. The machinery of cosmic guardianship moves forward without pause. Yet the absence of formal resolution does not erase the symbolic mark left behind by the relationship. Instead, it transforms the situation into something more durable than a single narrative event. It becomes a lingering question embedded within the mythology of the Corps, a point of tension that readers revisit whenever they attempt to interpret the ethical landscape of that universe. Within the narrative world itself, Hal Jordan and Arisia continue to exist as lanterns whose competence and courage remain undeniable. Their ability to protect entire sectors from destruction is never called into question. The operational logic of the Corps remains indifferent to the philosophical debates that surround them. What matters in battle is clarity of will, not the social frameworks of any single civilization. But mythology rarely operates according to operational logic. Myths persist because they carry symbolic contradictions that cannot be resolved easily. The relationship between Hal Jordan and Arisia becomes one of those contradictions. It sits quietly within the history of the Green Lantern narrative, like a fracture line running through otherwise stable ground. For some observers, the fracture represents a cautionary example about the dangers of power and admiration existing within the same emotional space. The early mentorship between Hal Jordan and Arisia remains impossible to erase from memory. Even if her later competence establishes autonomy, the symbolic origin of their connection continues to influence how the relationship is perceived. In this interpretation, the narrative reveals how easily admiration can evolve into intimacy when authority and proximity overlap. For others, the fracture reveals something different. It exposes the limitations of moral systems built within the narrow time frame of human development. The universe depicted by the Green Lantern Corps includes civilizations whose biological timelines challenge every assumption humans use to define maturity. Within that context, applying Earth's social boundaries without adjustment may appear less like moral clarity and more like cultural projection. The persistence of this disagreement ensures that the relationship never settles into a single definitive interpretation. Instead, it continues to function as a symbolic crossroads where different moral intuitions collide. Each new generation of readers encounters the same tension and must decide which framework they consider more persuasive. The endurance of this tension reveals something fundamental about the role of fiction within cultural consciousness. Stories do not survive merely because their plots resolve cleanly. They endure because they introduce questions that remain unsettled long after the narrative ends. Characters become vessels through which societies explore anxieties that cannot easily be addressed through direct discourse. Hal Jordan's role within this symbolic structure becomes particularly complex because of his status as a heroic figure. He represents courage, resilience, and defiance against overwhelming threats. The Green Lantern ring responds to his will precisely because it embodies the determination to confront fear rather than retreat from it. When such a character becomes entangled in an ethically ambiguous relationship, the audience faces a dilemma. The heroic identity that once appeared stable must now coexist with behavior that some observers interpret as troubling. This coexistence forces readers to reconsider the assumption that heroism automatically guarantees moral perfection. In that sense, the controversy surrounding Hal Jordan and Arisia introduces a subtle realism into the mythology of the Corps. Heroic figures remain subject to the same interpretive uncertainties that govern ordinary human behavior. Their actions cannot always be reduced to simple categories of virtue or failure. Arisia's legacy within this dynamic is equally significant. Her character disrupts the conventional narrative role often assigned to younger or inexperienced figures in heroic stories. She does not remain frozen within the identity of an admirer or apprentice. Her growth as a lantern demonstrates independence, courage, and intellectual clarity. Yet that very independence complicates the moral interpretation of her relationship with Hal Jordan. If she were portrayed as vulnerable or manipulated, the narrative would produce a clearer ethical boundary. Instead, her agency forces readers to grapple with the possibility that admiration and autonomy can coexist in ways that challenge familiar categories. The enduring power of the storyline lies precisely in this refusal to simplify the emotional landscape surrounding the characters. The narrative does not present Hal Jordan as a villain exploiting vulnerability, nor does it portray Arisia as an innocent incapable of understanding her own feelings. Instead, it places two individuals within a universe where cultural frameworks collide and asks the audience to navigate the resulting ambiguity. Over time, the controversy becomes absorbed into the broader mythology of the Green Lantern Corps. It joins other moments within the franchise where the complexity of interstellar civilization exposes the limitations of human assumptions. Encounters with alien cultures have always forced lanterns to confront ethical dilemmas that resist easy classification. The relationship between Hal Jordan and Arisia represents one of the most intimate versions of that confrontation. Instead of occurring during diplomatic negotiations or planetary crises, the conflict unfolds within the emotional lives of two individuals who represent the Corps itself. As a result, the question introduced by their relationship continues to echo quietly through the narrative universe. What does maturity mean when biological timelines differ radically across species? What responsibilities accompany admiration when authority and intimacy share the same emotional space? And to what extent can moral frameworks designed for one civilization claim universal authority in a universe defined by diversity? The story offers no final answer. Instead, it leaves behind a symbolic structure that continues to provoke reflection long after the events themselves have faded into the background of the Green Lantern mythos. Readers return to the question again and again, not because the narrative demands resolution, but because the tension it exposes remains recognizable. The Corps still patrols the universe. Rings continue to choose new bearers. Civilizations rise and fall beneath the silent watch of lanterns who carry the same symbol of will across countless stars. But somewhere within that immense structure a quiet fracture remains. And like all fractures embedded within myth, it never truly disappears. It simply waits for the next observer to notice the line running through the foundation.